warm thank you, especially to the Department of Communication. You guys have done so much for us, and also the team members of AppSpeaks that have made this possible. Specifically within the department, I'd like to thank Dr. Moore and Ms. Susan Foreman. Here they are, round of applause. They put a lot of their personal time coming to auditions, giving our speakers feedback, and overall just trying to make this a really great show for you guys. I'd also like to thank student programs for all their work, especially Cindy in that office, booking all the rehearsal rooms, booking this space, and dealing with our numerous requests. And also Stick Boy Bread for their donations at the end of the show. Are you guys ready? Yeah! I'd like to introduce Miss Sarah Mylan. She's also on the planning committee for Panorama. Hey, I won't bother y'all with myself too long. We have 6 wonderful speakers lined up for y'all tonight. Each talk will last between 5 to 15 minutes. Our first speaker is Anna Somerville. She's a senior global studies major. Please welcome Anna to the stage.
Hey everyone, my name is Anna Somerville, and like Sarah said, I'm going to be talking about belonging and narrative. This concept is really important to me and really special to me. So I want you to take a minute to think for a minute about who you are. Where are you from? Where do you belong? What is your story? This is a little bit about my story. I remember the first time I asked my parents if I could dye my hair black. I was tired of people asking me if I was adopted, if my mom was my Oriental nanny, or if I didn't belong with my family. I can still see the face of the boy who looked at me on the first day of 6th grade as I reheated my sticky rice and seaweed, and he whispered to his friends that my family must be communists. Within my Korean circle of family, the feelings were similar. I remember sitting in Korean church, surrounded by wrinkled ladies fawning over my blonde hair and fair skin, in words I couldn't understand. My brother and sister and I would thank them in the few words of Korean we knew, and they would respond with camera flashes and loud exclamations of our impressive pronunciation. My family straddled both worlds, never fully standing with our whole selves in either one. We were American and not Korean, but we were Korean and not American. We were cultural nomads, finding a home somewhere in the in-between. Our identities floated amidst our different realities and cultures as we had a place in both, and yet neither at the same time. I have traced this theme of belonging throughout my life. This innate desire to have a place where I fit. As I've questioned and wrestled with this concept, I've come to the conclusion that this deeply rooted need to belong is universal to all humans. I'm sure some of you have felt the same. It is a need that is naturally accentuated for outsiders, for people who have been displaced or whose cultural differences seem to always leave them at the fringe. That same pull for belonging is still just as evident today in my life as it was for that confused little girl who just wanted to look like her mom, who desperately wanted to be a part of something bigger than herself. I do not think I'm alone in this desire. I think it, in fact, is innate to our human nature. We all crave our space, our niche, that perfect place that will provide us with the necessary means to develop, to understand, and to feel pride in who we are. As I perused the library database on this topic, I found my own emotional response to the literature stronger than I expected. I feasted on the words I found, because in a sense they validated my own lifelong struggle for belonging and identity. I found comfort in the research that seemed to indicate that my very being was hardwired for wanting to communicate and understand my cultural identity. In 1995, psychologists Roy F. Baumeister and Mark Leary developed the theory of belongingness, which asserts that human beings are fundamentally motivated by a deep need to belong, evident by the natural drive to form and sustain interpersonal attachments. Whether it is a group of friends from your neighborhood, the family you were born into, or the culture you identify with, humans all have deeply rooted longings to be accepted as members of community. We want to be known. We want to be understood. We want to be listened to. In order to avoid the negative consequences of a lack of belonging, It is important to find tools that can assist us in understanding our place in the world, as well as the other people that we interact with on a daily basis. In today's increasingly globalized society, people are highly mobile, and communities are much more transient than they were in the past. I believe that sharing and listening to the personal stories of the people around us has the power to strengthen and bind people together in a sense of shared space that will help us develop our identities, highlight our commonalities, and appreciate our differences, because no two stories are the same. The meaningful ties created through storytelling make it an appropriate means to foster belonging and to further understanding between people. One reason that stories resonate with humankind is because they speak to our hearts. Stories reveal truths and experiences in a way that no other literary form does. Narrative is, in many ways, the very language of our hearts. Additionally, we are not just passive listeners. Our brains actively respond when we hear or read a story. In fact, when we receive narrative information, we relate it to our own lives. The human brain is proved to have mirror neurons in the cortex, which relate what a person sees or hears to that person's own experience. So listening to and processing another person's story is actually proven to help us understand them better. Storytelling helps create connection and empathy, and it is empathy that leads to understanding. The prevalence of storytelling throughout history clearly demonstrates its power and impact. Stories are timeless. Stories are universal. And because stories are relevant to every people group, they bring out what is common between us. Stories are used daily to defend a position, to illustrate a key point, to make people laugh, or simply to enhance conversation. Every person of every nation experiences common emotions, such as delight, anger, panic, or doubt. We all know the pain of suffering, and although those experiences may be different, the feelings strike a similar chord. Personally, storytelling has provided me with a greater sense of belonging within my own cultural identity. I identify as a third culture kid, as someone who has grown up between multiple countries or communities or cultures, thus creating a unique combination or third space. Ironically, even though I've spent the majority of my life in the United States, I feel as if I have grown up between multiple worlds. I'm a quarter Korean, although both of my parents grew up in South Korea, which makes me feel a little bit more Asian than my genes may express. My unique family, my diverse community, my jumbled mix of languages, foods, traditions, and ideas, this is my culture, and I love it. It is what has shaped and molded me from the very beginning. And while I am incredibly proud of my diverse heritage, I'd be lying to you if I told you that I haven't faced significant frustration as I've tried to make sense of my place in the middle of it all. In addition to my parents, most of my extended family, many of my aunts, uncles, cousins, and both sets of my grandparents have spent the majority of their lives in Asia. I am the granddaughter of a North Korean refugee. I'm a member of one of the thousands of families that was separated between North and South Korea at the end of the war. And this reality brings up a very interesting tension in my own life. If few of my closest family members feel a deep sense of belonging in the United States, how can I? Without strong roots in the dominant culture in which I live, where do I belong? I naturally gravitate towards other people with similar emotions, those who are cultural outsiders or who fall into their own third culture, sharing a common understanding of what it's like to exist in this ambiguous yet familiar in-between space. I would like to share one story with you. This story has perhaps been the most significant one in my life, in many ways, and it is the story of my grandfather, Woo Taeg Lee, who was born in the small fishing village of Hamcheon on the west coast of what is now North Korea. He's the second from the left, or the second from the right. At the time of my grandfather's birth, Korea was under the Japanese occupation, as it had been since 1910. This was an incredibly dark and hopeless time in Korean history, as the Japanese oppressors attempted harshly and deliberately to erase Korean cultural identity. Artwork and literature was burned, some artists executed, and the Korean language forbidden in an attempt to purge the nation of its nationalism. My grandfather talks about his days in grade school, where time was dedicated to manual labor, building airfields by hand with pick and shovel, instead of reading books. In 1945, World War II ended, and the Japanese were forced to surrender. The day of liberation was short-lived because soon the Soviets had control of the North and the United States the South. At this time, my grandfather in 1947 was 17 years old, and he decided he wanted to go south for educational opportunities. Today, he still recalls the mandate given to his family to give their harvested crops to the Russians. The day a policeman ransacked their house, taking with them their Bibles and religious texts, and the tear-stained face of his mother as she was mocked by Soviet soldiers. When he tells the story, he says, "When I saw the way they treated my mother, I knew there was no future in this place." And indeed, there was no future in that place for my grandfather. His escape was brave and terrifying, as he was shipwrecked, stranded, and imprisoned before eventually crossing the 38th parallel. In many ways, this seems like the ending of his story. And while so much was lost, his story didn't end there, and neither did mine. My grandfather is the bravest, wisest, and kindest man I know. He is one of the heroes in my story. And through his story of perseverance, hope, and a deep, abiding faith, I am reminded to be hopeful myself. Our stories are hard, but the hard is good too. The hard is honest, and the hard is necessary for us to grow, learn, and love. As a stranger in a foreign land, my grandfather would move to the United States, where he would be an outsider. He would marry a woman from Texas, and they would move back to Korea, where she would also be an outsider. Their children would always feel the pulls and complexities of their multi-ethnic identity. My mom would marry my dad, who also felt in many ways that he belonged neither here nor there. And then there would be me. And on the outside, I have no reason for anybody to ask me about my culture or why it affects me on a daily basis. I appear to fit in and belong, and in many ways I do. But on the inside, my heart continues to wrestle as someone who is still figuring out her place. And the truth is that while on this earth, I may never find the perfect place that I fit. I don't expect to. But I believe that stories and the lessons they teach us have the potential to bind us together in a belonging that comes through shared relationships and empathy for each other's stories and experiences, for the good, for the hard, for the hopeful. This life of my grandfather in North Korea means something to who I am. It is not merely a story. I am part of it. It is part of my story. And reflecting on my own life and my own story and listening compassionately to the stories of others encourages empathy and provides a powerful means of self-expression. Questions that dive into the complex narratives of loss and brokenheartedness, love, fear, joy, and sorrow. These are necessary in understanding who we are. Author Donald Miller says that we live in a world where bad stories are told. Stories that teach us that life doesn't mean anything and that humanity has no great purpose. It's a good calling, then, to speak a better story. How brightly a better story shines. How easily the world looks to it in wonder. How grateful we are to hear these stories, and how happy it makes us to repeat them. So let us learn the importance of this, to have compassion as listeners of other people's stories, so as to cultivate empathy and a deep desire to know. I think, in the end, if I'm right, it will make us entirely more thankful people, because stories comfort us, they sustain us. Or as Madeline L'Engle writes, stories make us more alive, more human, more courageous, and more loving. My own experience with my family sometimes makes me feel different, but it also draws me towards other people who are cultural outsiders. I am eager to hear their experiences, to know them, and to repeat their stories. It is through these stories that a deep sense of belonging is forged. And because a strong sense of belonging inspires security and community, rather than isolation, insecurity, and discrimination, this leads us to a way of life that turns us outward rather than inward. And that's how I want to live. Stories that humanize the other, highlight what is common between us, and emphasize the beauty in our differences.